May 24, 1941. An armor-piercing shell is widely believed to trigger the chain reaction that ends the pride of the Royal Navy, the battlecruiser His Majesty's ship Hood. In approximately 3 minutes, 1,415 men die, only 3 survive. The ship does not sink intact. A catastrophic magazine detonation tears it apart at the surface, and the broken mass vanishes into the Denmark Strait. For 6 decades, the exact resting place of one of the largest Royal Navy warships lost in action remains unknown. What is missing is not just a wreck, but an unlocated war grave. With only 3 survivors, the record has to be rebuilt from witness memories aboard nearby ships, reinforced by logs, signals, and after-action reports. On the surface, visual proof is erased in minutes. Hood vanishes into the freezing waters of the Denmark Strait. The physical mechanics of the loss will dictate the wreck. Built for speed and heavy firepower, a battlecruiser depends on an armor scheme designed to defeat incoming fire at expected angles. On that morning, the geometry of the engagement may have let a heavy shell reach past the strongest protection and into the vulnerable after magazines. Those enclosed spaces held tens of tons of cordite, enough to turn a brief penetration into a catastrophic blast, even if the exact strike point would later be impossible to prove from surviving structure. Cordite ignition inside an enclosed steel magazine does not simply burn. It accelerates into a violent deflagration. Expanding gases drive crushing overpressure through bulkheads and decks, hunting weak seams until the ship's structural strength is overwhelmed. In moments, the hull loses integrity and begins to break into massive, separate structures even before the sea fully takes control. This is not a slow, flooded descent. Heavy, fragmented sections of steel drop immediately into the deep. The stern, the midships mass, and the bow separate at the surface. The bow pitches up, then slides under, and the broken ship vanishes into the Denmark Strait. The historical fact of this catastrophic event defines the ultimate survey target. Knowing the exact lethality and the nature of the surface breakup dictates what future searchers will eventually look for. They know they will never find an intact hull resting quietly on the seabed. They must look for a violently shattered debris field. However, this reality creates a profound historical and physical limit. The ocean swallows the evidence completely. At this depth, near freezing water, pressure, and currents keep the wreck beyond direct human reach. The site can only be approached through instruments and robotics, with no room for casual error. For decades, no expedition can confirm the wreck's coordinates or the descent path of the broken sections. The last reliable facts end where eyewitness optics lose the ship. Everything after that remains sealed on the seabed. The immense loss of life permanently solidifies the site as a war grave of unprecedented scale. The memory of the 1,415 men demands that the site eventually be found and formally documented. With no fixed marker on the surface, the hunt becomes a modern forensic problem. The ultimate challenge shifts from wartime survival to a profound modern forensic problem. The target is massively heavy, definitively broken, and lost in the abyss. The answer begins with math, sonar, and remote cameras, not divers. Locating a legendary sunken vessel can mean salvage, but this target is different. The wreck lies in the Erminger Basin of the Denmark Strait at a crushing depth of about 9,334 feet, roughly 2,845 meters. Near freezing water, immense pressure, and bottom currents make access difficult. Yet the decisive barrier is legal, not mechanical. Hood is tightly controlled by the British government. Under the Protection of Military Remains Act 1986, the wreck is a designated protected place, making any unauthorized disturbance or removal an offense under UK law. Beyond that, it is treated as a sovereign immune warship, so any work requires explicit UK consent, even in international waters. Permits collapse to one rule: observe and document without contact or disturbance. That constraint defines the mission. Find the site with acoustics, then read it with cameras using only remote systems. Operating at that depth requires sophisticated robotics. The survey team must rely on highly specialized, remotely operated vehicles tethered to a surface ship by miles of heavy armored cable. Piloting these robots under standard conditions is difficult, but the legal boundary drastically increases the operational risk. The pilot must navigate the deep ocean currents and maneuver the heavy vehicle close enough to the wreckage to capture high-resolution imagery. At the same time, the pilot must avoid contact and prevent any disturbance to the wreck. A single miscalculation could cause the submersible or its heavy tether to snag on the jagged steel of the site. Snagging the wreck would violate the fundamental terms of the permit and disturb the legally protected war grave. With the no-contact boundary in place, every gain has to come from standoff navigation, sonar returns, and camera work, nothing else. This boundary delivers a result before a camera ever reaches the bottom. It preempts unauthorized salvage. The designation blocks rogue commercial operators from stripping the site for scrap or trophies, securing the war grave in law. Depth does more than challenge the machinery. It punishes contact. Even if the law allowed manipulation, pressure, and conditions in the Erminger Basin would make extraction likely to destroy fragile structural evidence. The mandate is entirely forensic and entirely visual. The cameras must document the current state of the metal, observe the vast distribution of the wreckage, and formally memorialize the location without altering the position of a single piece of steel. The entire operation is designed around respectful observation from a safe distance. The rules of engagement were definitively set, and the boundary was permanently locked, but the abyssal target still had to be found. Locating a highly specific target in the deep ocean usually demands months of blind sweeping. Yet this expedition locates the primary wreck targets in just 39 hours of sonar towing. Positive identification comes after, when cameras and lights descend into the abyss and the shapes resolve into a shattered warship. Dropping a deep tow sensor without a refined grid guarantees failure. The basin is simply too vast. To build a workable search box, investigators reconstruct the surface engagement from deck logs, recorded celestial navigation, course alterations, and witness bearings, then cross-reference those points against weather and currents. The result is a high-probability drop zone, small enough to tow, wide enough to admit real uncertainty. In July 2001, an expedition led by deep-sea explorer David Mearns of Blue Water Recoveries puts this mathematical model to the test, commissioned for a Channel 4 documentary project. They arrive on station and deploy a heavy side-scan sonar array on a reinforced cable over the stern. The deep tow sensor package descends slowly, eventually stabilizing just above the pitch-black seafloor. It transmits high-frequency acoustic pulses laterally across the bottom, listening for the distinctive sharp echo returns of man-made geometry. Natural geology produces soft, irregular acoustic shadows. Heavy naval steel produces hard, high-contrast blocks on the monitor. Within the predicted box, the sonar quickly registers immense artificial structures. The operators read hard, man-made returns in real time as the tow track crosses the main concentration of targets. However, acoustic mapping hits a hard physical limit. The sonar provides precise coordinates and identifies massive structural blocks, but it cannot see. The extreme environmental depth and the total absence of natural light mandate that all close-range identification relies strictly on remote visual sensors. The sonar map acts merely as a targeting mechanism. To positively identify the warship, the expedition must transition entirely to high-resolution optics. The team recovers the sonar array and deploys a highly specialized remotely operated vehicle to make the deep descent. The vertical transit takes hours. As the robot sinks through the freezing water column, the crew meticulously manages the immense length of the armored umbilical tether. This cable provides the critical power and data link to the surface, but it is highly vulnerable to the deep ocean currents that constantly sweep across the basin. The pilot must maintain absolute control as the vehicle approaches the bottom. Upon reaching the target depth, the remotely operated vehicle activates banks of high-intensity lighting to pierce the total darkness. The robot serves as a purely optical proxy, flying strictly by instruments and camera feeds. The pilot executes careful sweeps over the acoustic targets, holding a strict standoff altitude so thrusters do not kick up sediment and blind the lenses. Video and stills stream continuously as the vehicle traces the site's perimeter without touching steel. Then the first hard shapes emerge from the dark. A massive internal explosion does not destroy a heavily armored steel box uniformly. It vents outward through weaker boundaries, leaving a signature that investigators can read, even decades later. When the high-definition cameras pan across the pitch-black seafloor, they reveal the ship's heaviest surviving mass, the midship's block. It rests inverted and partly embedded in soft mud, consistent with a hard impact after a long fall. Along the port side, the outer armor belt appears largely intact, an immediate reminder of how strong the original engineering was. But on the starboard side, the cameras find the signature, a staggering void where heavy plating is simply missing down to internal structure. That absence is consistent with violent internal overpressure, venting laterally, peeling armor away as the blast hunted for the weakest path out. With the starboard wall gone, the surviving block loses its balance and rolls hard over during the fall, explaining its inverted rest on the seabed. While the starboard void clearly maps the violent exit path of the blast wave, the coherent wreckage ultimately hits a definitive proof ceiling. The investigators aim to determine the precise initiation point of the destruction, but the physical evidence for that initial trigger simply no longer exists. The survey looks for the exact entry point of the heavy enemy shell that started the fatal chain reaction. They cannot find a single trace of it anywhere on the primary hull. The aft area around the rear magazines was obliterated in the detonation, removing the very structure that could show where a plunging shell penetrated. And because the permit forbids recovery or sediment clearing, the cameras can only document what is missing. The initiating strike angle and exact entry point remain beyond proof. The midship's block answers one question with clarity: how the blast vented and how the ship's spine failed, but it also defines the gap. Key structures aft are gone, and the initiating strike cannot be read from what survives on this main mass. To complete the picture, the survey has to move outward into the dispersed debris fields where the missing sections came to rest. A massive, uniformly sinking vessel drops relatively straight down, but violently shattered steel sections falling through 9,200 feet of water create an immense geometric trap on the seafloor. The site features two distinct debris fields, heavily concentrated into an eastern zone and a western zone. This vast spatial separation is not random. It is the direct physical result of differential drag, operating on massive detached structures during an extremely long vertical descent. That drift is why the debris has to be surveyed as separate zones, not as a single fall line. The remotely operated vehicle transits laterally across the deep ocean floor to document these detached sectors. Far removed from the heavy central mass, the cameras locate the completely severed bow. The visual confirmation of this massive structure provides a crucial piece of forensic evidence. The bow is fundamentally separate from the central wreckage. Finding it resting alone definitively proves that it violently detached and fell completely independently from the rest of the ship. It did not fold back over the hull, it sheared away and fell as its own body. With a cleaner hydrodynamic shape than the shattered midship's mass, it would have ridden drag and cross currents differently during the long descent. The result is measurable. The bow rests alone on the order of roughly 650 feet from the main wreckage. The cameras continue their careful lateral sweep, moving slowly over the massive eastern and western zones. The lenses document enormous, unrecognizable fragments of the superstructure, heavy gun turrets, and scattered internal bulkheads. By mapping the exact coordinates of these detached components, the expedition reads the sequence of destruction in reverse. The heaviest, most structurally coherent blocks fell the fastest and deviated the least. The flatter, lighter panels of the shattered superstructure caught the deep cross currents, fluttering and spiraling outward like massive metal leaves. This sorting mechanism explains exactly why the main heavy sections sit relatively close to the calculated center, while the thinner steel plate is scattered vastly wider across the two distinct remote zones. This separation imposes its own ceiling on the investigation. With major pieces spread across widely spaced zones, the ROV burns precious dive time just transiting, and investigators cannot reunite matching tiers or edges to reconstruct the blast the way a dry dock could. The site has to be read as isolated fragments, each frozen where it fell. With the wreck read as separate fragments on the seabed, the next question becomes what, if anything, can be recovered without violating the grave. After enforcing an absolute non-intervention rule for 14 years, the British government makes a singular, highly calculated exception to its own strict jurisdictional boundary. the Ministry of Defense officially authorizes the physical recovery of one specific artifact from the abyssal debris field. This decision fundamentally flips the established protocol, but it relies on a very specific set of forensic and ethical parameters. In the ship's final survivors last years, he made his wish unmistakably clear: recover the ship's bell and let it stand as a permanent physical memorial to the 1,415 men who died in the Denmark Strait. Approving this request carries immense institutional risk. The government must ensure that permitting one recovery does not create a legal loophole for future commercial looters. To honor the request without violating the sanctity of the mass war grave, the operation must satisfy the absolute strictest requirements of a conditionally permitted extraction. The legal approval hinges entirely on the exact physical coordinates of the bell. The earlier remote visual surveys confirmed that the massive bronze bell lies completely isolated on the deep ocean floor. It rests in a remote sector of the debris field, well away from the shattered main hull, the severed bow, and any concentrated areas of human remains. Because a remotely operated vehicle can lift the artifact without touching, moving, or disturbing any primary structural wreckage, the government legally permits this single, highly isolated extraction. In August 2015, a private expedition funded by American philanthropist Paul G. Allen brings a specialized deep-water research vessel back to the site. The team sends a heavy ROV back down to the same crushing depth, holding both vehicle and tether clear of the protected wreck as it closes on the isolated bell. Operating with immense mechanical precision, the pilot maneuvers the robotic arms to gently secure the heavy bronze artifact. They carefully lift the bell from the thick bottom sediment and begin the long, slow vertical transit back to the surface. The robot brings the bell into the light for the first time since 1941. The successful physical lift immediately introduces a new chemical challenge. The massive artifact endured exactly 74 years of deep seawater immersion. The extreme environmental exposure deeply ingrained destructive chlorides into the metallic structure. Removing the bell from the crushing abyssal pressure and the near-freezing temperatures, and then introducing it to oxygenated surface air, triggers a rapid chemical degradation process. To permanently stabilize the artifact, marine conservators placed the bell into specialized desalination baths as part of a year-long conservation program, and sometimes longer if the chemistry demands it. This slow, highly disciplined restoration works to draw out destructive chlorides and stabilize the metal, ensuring the artifact can survive on display in a national museum. The lift is authorized as a one-time, tightly bounded exception. Afterward, the Ministry of Defense reasserts the baseline regime. The wreck remains a protected place and a sovereign immune warship, with no further removals, sampling, or interference permitted, and unauthorized disturbance prosecutable under UK law. Across 2 expeditions, the teams locate Hood, define the main wreck blocks, and map the debris fields with sonar and remote cameras. The imagery reads the blast's exit signature and the ship's structural failure without breaching the wreck or disturbing the fallen crew. The wreck remains on the seabed as a protected place in sovereign immune warship. Only the restored bell returns to the surface, an authorized exception, so the memorial can endure in the open air again.